It won't surprise you to learn that critical thinking is a fading skill set. The brain is like a muscle, and the less you use it, the more it atrophies. Steve Perlman noticed the absence of critical thinking skills as a professor and set out to study the frameworks and pathways to exercise our minds in ways that improve the depth and breadth of our thought processes. Steve and I sat down for a fascinating discussion on the breakdown of critical thinking, the challenges of future generations as they grow up with artificial intelligence, and his work at the Critical Thinking Institute to combat the erosion of this uniquely human skill set. I'm Damon Davis, and this is my Discovery Diary with the most recognized expert in critical thinking there is, Steve Pearlman. Steve, take me back and just give me a sense of your background. What even got you to a point of starting a critical thinking institute, and what drove you to it?
Well, I spent about 30 years in higher education, and I originally started in composition theory, writing theory, where my degree is. That's where my doctoral degree is. And that meant that I was teaching writing and I was teaching thought. And therefore, my natural emphasis in doing that was on critical thinking, which I thought would be what just about everybody's emphasis would be in doing that, because what more important thing can we think about and teach people than critical thinking? As I like to say, if you don't think critical thinking is the most important thing there is, then I'd like you to think about the fact that you just had to think that. And so I was shocked to learn that most other educators were actually not focusing as much on critical thinking, especially in my particular field, because I wasn't teaching history and I wasn't teaching science. I was teaching people how to compose ideas in the first place. Eventually, my focus on that led another major university about 10 years ago, about 15 years ago now, to invite me to raise critical thinking outcomes across the entire campus. I'm talking about first-year students through Ph.D. candidates in every discipline across the university. Now, that would seem like something that had been done before. It seemed like there should be plenty of models for how to go about raising critical thinking outcomes across a university, but there were none. In fact, it really hadn't been done before. And in fact, nobody had really even taken on the effort. A few minor colleges had tried some small initiatives to varying degrees of success and failure. No one had really done it. So I had to not only figure out how to do it, I had to reinvent ways to teach and conceptualize critical thinking so that everyone could learn it easily. And the biggest challenge in doing that, actually, I'll just let you in on this. The biggest challenge in doing that is this. There are plenty of very complex models that represent what critical thinking is very well, but you're never going to teach a student to follow them. We're talking about massive flow charts and science and so forth. Right. And then there's some very simple concepts of what critical thinking is, but they undermine the complexity of how complex our thoughts can be. And so I had to find the balance, and I had to invent new ways to accomplish that.
May I ask you, what were you seeing or not seeing on the college campuses that made you think, wow, we've got a serious critical thinking gap here? What drove it that you were seeing or not seeing in the students?
Well, let's put aside the fact that every faculty member and educator will tell you that kids these days can't think critically enough. And that's always been true, but nevertheless, it's even more true now. But the research on critical thinking in our society is catastrophic. Half of Americans failed a simple critical thinking test. Another biggest percentage got a D, and only a very fractional percentage got an A. Across campuses, depending upon the study that we find, we're looking at, maybe 10% of students at the junior or senior level are capable of passing a critical thinking test or showing real proficiency in critical thinking. So the problem is very clear. Schools are not teaching critical thinking skills. And I think most parents and I think most people who've been through college recognize this, that they weren't really taught how to think better. Now, I'm not saying that some people didn't acquire some better thinking skills in the course of college. And I'm not saying they didn't have this course or that course that maybe taught them how to write an argument or taught them how to debate well. But those are just fractions, really, of what full critical thinking actually encompasses. So everyone knows that this is a problem. all the educators know that this is a problem. Most people who've been through college know this is a problem. Parents certainly know this is a problem, and nobody was doing anything about it. And that's where I stepped up, and also why I founded the Critical Thinking Institute.
So concretely, you were seeing things like poorly formed thoughts because the critical thinking wasn't there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say not only do we see poorly formed thoughts from students and people in general, but often we found no thought, that largely what was being projected from the students was regurgitation of information, which is, by the way, largely what we asked them to do. Right. And
Mhm.
so mostly what we would get is summary, we would get fact, and we really wouldn't get anything that constituted their particular thinking at all. When we did get something that was their thinking, typically what we got was opinion. And you know
Mhm.
the saying about opinions, how everybody has one and what they're like. And that's typically what was opinion. We didn't really get actual thought that was constructed through evidence and logic and complex reasoning skills and processes and so forth. We
Yeah.
got, something that they happen to think to be true, which is very nice, except it really had no bearing on reality or deep thinking skills.
I'm smiling because I know what you're talking about, opinions. The
Yeah.
old adage, and I won't use the bad words, is everybody has an opinion and they're like backsides. Everybody
Yeah.
thinks everyone else's stinks, right? Nobody
Right.
likes anyone else's opinion. So
Correct.
I can appreciate where you were going there. That's really interesting. I'm wondering then, so you've gone from campus development to creating an actual institute. How did you get to this place of developing the institute, and what is the purpose of the institute in general?
Well, what became clear to me, I was doing lots of presentations for academic institutions, which I still do today. And sometimes they're very worthwhile. But for the most part, what would happen is I would go and do a presentation at a university or at an organization or a campus event or a conference. And people would be wanting me to come in and teach them. How do we teach critical thinking? We need to be able to do it. And so I would go in and I'd show them. And then nothing would happen. Most of the time, the educators didn't take action on what tools I gave them to teach critical thinking. And the reason they didn't is that it required them to change their practices. Now, I want to be fair because a lot of people in the public school systems simply don't have the room, they don't have the space in their classrooms to adopt different pedagogies and try different things because they're under so many structural constraints from the school districts and the government and so forth. And so they really couldn't do it. And I want to be sympathetic to that. But there were a lot of other educators who could do it and said it was important and said it's what they wanted and then opted not to. And so I realized that disseminating this, of course, there were those who did, and that was very gratifying. And I still work with a lot of them today. But I realized that disseminating critical thinking skills through the educational system was a very inefficient way to go in accomplishing it. So I broke away from academia and founded the Critical Thinking Institute so that we can offer direct critical thinking instruction to members of the public.
Mm.
And that we have programs for kids, we have programs for adults. They're really the same program, just packaged differently and presented differently. But I realized that we needed to get this out to people directly because the world needs it desperately. And we have a unique way of accomplishing it that achieves remarkable results, and people should be able to do it.
I love that. That's amazing. And you're absolutely right. The democratization of this kind of data and information and concept is incredibly important. And one of the things, so I met you at JT Fox's Mega Success in LA a little over a week ago. And I was so taken by everything that you said on stage. We chatted a little bit and you said, I've got a TED talk on that if you want to go on deeper into this and the idea of democratizing the information. There's no better platform really for getting it out to the masses than a TED Talk. Yours has, I think, over 500,000 views, which is incredible. It speaks to the importance of the topic that you've raised. And in your talk, you bring up several points that I would love for you to just walk through a little bit. Perceiving our environment, sensing danger and deciding between danger and reward, and then acting on the decision. Do you want to go through that sort of basis of the primordial critical thinking and then how you've changed it into what you've taught the students? It seems like you've adapted that into another more modern model.
Yeah. One of the biggest breakthroughs that I made in researching all of this was that recognizing that the way most people were defined, virtually everyone was defining critical thinking, basically had to do with what was a popular conception of what critical thinking might be. And so if you were to offer me, or any of you were to write down a definition of critical thinking, I'm sure that they would come up with a positive one. They would come up with words like analyze or evaluate. They'd say things like evidence or objectivity. They'd say things like precision. They might say things like thinking outside the box, which is great, except how do we know what's outside the box? And the fact that an idea is outside the box doesn't make it a good idea. They're ridiculous outside the box ideas that have nothing to do with critical thinking.
That's true. I've told my son, I've said, listen, dude, every time you say, I've got a great idea, it's probably not a great idea as outside the
Right.
box as it is.
Right. So I said, well, there has to be a way to define critical thinking that's not just based on what we think, what language we think we should attribute to it. What's the real core of it? And that took me into, a decade of research that culminated in my finding research by microbiologists, evolutionary microbiologists, who discovered that single-celled organisms have four thinking abilities that they do. And every organism, every animal organism on the planet shares these four thinking skills. And that is the ability to perceive the environment, sense danger versus reward, choose between danger and reward, and then take an action. So basically, very simply, what's around me, what's out there that I might want to eat, what's out there that might want to eat me, what do I do in this circumstance between what might want to eat me and what I can eat, and then taking an action accordingly. All right. Now, that's very simplistic, but that's how all animal organisms function at the base level in terms of their thinking structure. Our thinking is layered on top of that. So that core mechanism for thinking is still active in our brains. It is the core function through which we do everything that we do. Every decision that every one of your listeners has ever made and will ever make is still operating on that base core structure. As I said, we have layers and layers of other potential thinking skills above that. But a lot of times that's really all we're doing is using that system. So I said, well, if that's the core system and we can't escape it no matter what we try to do, then let's build a thinking system that takes that instinctive thinking system and turns it into an intellectual thinking system. And that's why my approach to teaching critical thinking is so distinct and so more successful than all the others. It's simply because I'm working with what your brain's already doing when it thinks, and I'm teaching you how to tap into that core system and improve upon it for intellectual thinking instead of just survival thinking.
Interesting. You've helped folks to identify what their thought process is so that they can hone and refine it to be better at it as they go into various situations. And I can't help thinking that part of your critical thinking is going to be based on experiential inputs, right? That you and I are going to have two completely different sets of experiences based on what part of the country we grew up, the color of our skin, we will have some similar ones because we're both males, but there's going to be some experiences that are going to influence your critical thinking. How do you apply that when you're talking to students about their critical thinking, their experiential basis?
Damon, I got to tell you, that is a fascinating question. And it's a great one because I seldom get asked it. And it's really a very smart question, because one of the things that our brains do is they use things called, use technical terms here, schemas, in order to understand the world. Think of a schema like a framework, okay? Or an engram, which is actually how it's written in the brain. And by the way, our thinking structures are literally written into our brain structures. These are not just things we do. They're things that are embedded within our brains. We are always writing our brains. We're always building neural connections for everything that we do. So what we have these frameworks, and what happens is whenever we encounter a problem, what our brain does is it looks for the framework that's most applicable or most like that problem that we've encountered before. So you're going to build some different frameworks than I'm going to build, right? I'm going to build some different frameworks than you're going to build, and all of your listeners are going to build different frameworks as well. Okay, now then we might find similarities in those frameworks for sure, but nevertheless, we're going to build different frameworks. So your brain goes and it looks for the framework that's most applicable to the situation. Now there are two problems. The first is, it might make a mistake. Your brain could be wrong. It might simply choose the wrong framework. It chooses framework 37 when it should have chosen framework 53. Okay, that's one problem. It made an error. The second problem might be that there is no framework that directly correlates or corresponds to your present situation. And so what your brain does is it still finds the framework that's most likely to apply to that situation, and it uses that. But then it might be wrong again, because maybe that doesn't really apply. So we're always using these frameworks. So one of the things that we teach people how to do through the course is to identify the framework that your brain's trying to use and stop and think about the framework itself and how much it really does or does not apply to the present situation. So when we can become aware of our frameworks, then we can start to question them critically, think about them, and then modify them consciously to fit the new situation as appropriate. And when people can do that, their thinking elevates by leaps and bounds, because most people in the world are walking around like automatons. They're using their frameworks instinctively and applying them to the situations without knowing that they're doing.
Can you give an example? What is some automaton thinking that we just do on a regular basis that a listener will go, oh my God, I totally do that?
Well, think about anything that you do that's fairly instinctive. But I'll give you something really simple, right? If I say Donald Trump, everyone's going to have certain ideas flush into their heads. Some people are going to love him. Some people are going to hate him. Some people are in between. But words are going to come into people's heads as soon as I say Donald Trump, and feelings.
Yeah. Emotions, right? And words. Yeah. Descriptors, yeah. And feelings.
Right. Those are all instinctive frameworks that are starting to flood into your brain, that your brain wants to use because it's heard them and so forth, and wants to use these frameworks to think about Donald Trump. Now, that doesn't make them right. Everyone likes to think they're right about them, right? But we know that everyone's frameworks can't be right, and it's impossible. And here's what the scarier thing is, Damon, in today's world especially. We get our frameworks, and I just did a podcast on this myself. We get our frameworks now in terms of how we think about things like social issues, largely from social media. So whatever podcasts you listen to, whatever videos you watch, whatever news reports you get, right? Those are constructing your particular frameworks. So in our day and age, we're not in direct association with a thing that we're necessarily thinking about. We're thinking about it in a mediated way. It's mediated by the social media that we use and the news,
the algorithm that is feeding us what we've already acknowledged is something that we want to see more of.
Exactly. Well put. So whose frameworks are we using? Are we using our frameworks? We're not. We're often using frameworks that have been pre-constructed for us, and then, as you said, reinforced by algorithms from social media and the news. Now, we don't want to never have news, and we're going to have these mediated experiences. But what we do at the Institute is we give people the capacity to question those frameworks and to build their own frameworks better, so that we're not just falling into what the social media gives us, and we're not building these frameworks unconsciously. We become conscious of them and able to grapple with them and modify them. And that makes us smarter. It doesn't always make us right.
Yeah, right.
Better, right? It makes us better than we would be otherwise. And isn't that something, if nothing else, that we surely want for our kids? Because what kind of ideas of the world, of what it is to socialize, of what it is to be a good person, of what's valued, that they're getting from social media and their friends, right?
Yeah.
Very different than how you and I grew up.
Right. I can't help thinking the words that come to mind for me in this moment are, you don't know what you don't know, right? There's a 3-tiered thing, and I don't remember what all the knows and don't knows are, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I can't help thinking that this framework of critical thinking helps one at least be better in touch with all of those knows and don't knows. I'm now more clear on what I don't know, and I can acknowledge it, so I can either go search for that answer or just say that's not something that I actually need to dig into either. So this is fascinating to think through how we think through what we're thinking about and how we're, reacting to things. It's really interesting.
And one of the things that builds on that you're alluding to here again, which is wonderful, is the capacity to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Okay. We have to be comfortable with uncertainty. And most people don't like that. Most people are more binary in their thinking, right? They want to move from uncertainty to certainty very quickly. And that's why we have so many people who think they know and say things as if they know, because certainty is comforting to the
Yeah.
brain, right? Uncertainty is uncomfortable to the brain. Well, the more we can become comfortable with uncertainty, the more complexly we can look at the things around us. So that's another thing that we're really developing in people at the Institute, is how to be comfortable with being uncertain about things. It's okay.
It's
It's all
yeah.
right to be uncertain.
It's actually a great place because I tend to be a very positive thinker. And when I recognize that I don't know something, especially when it's something, so let's say you and I are in a conversation about two viewpoints and you say something that I've never thought of before, I get excited about that. So I'm like, wow, I never thought about it from that perspective. And it helps me to take on a new approach to that particular topic of discussion. I will probably go down a little bit of a rabbit hole and, off conversation and say, I want to know more about what Steve said about this thing and just expand my mind in that piece. And I think that's incredibly healthy, right? Because I've taken what you've offered and synthesized it into something that I want to know more about. And I think more people would benefit from that versus saying, oh man, I wish I had thought of that. And getting down on themselves or being critical or, feeling like they are stupid or whatever the other challenges may be in that. So I appreciate that you framed it that way. So one of the things you've done is you've talked to students and taught them a couple of things. You've morphed the primordial things into completing detailed analytic observations, developing complex questions and the clarifications around them, constructing multivariate evaluation, which I'd love for you to go into a little bit without getting too technical, and then deriving complex conclusions. Do you want to just walk us through at a high level what each of those means?
Sure. So very briefly, our analytic observations are this. The first thing we want to do when we look at the world is not judge it. And remember what I said, our brains want to be right as fast as possible. So I want you to think about how often we're making very rapid judgments about things that we see or hear, information that we get, people we encounter. And that's natural. It's instinctive for us to do that. It's a survival mechanism because you got to recognize that the bear is a threat very fast, right? Or you get eaten. That's so our brain's trained to do that. But what we teach people in terms of analytic observation is the first thing that you need to do if you want to think well is stop making quick judgments and just observe and try to, as objectively as we can, understand what might be potentially important. Not what is important, because that's a judgment. What factors are potentially important? And when we get people to do that, they start to see a lot more options about what to think about and what to value than they did otherwise. It goes up multifold.
That's really fascinating.
Right. So after we do that, what was the second one that you described? It
The
was
second one was developing complex questions and clarifications.
Yeah. So the high percentage of thinking errors are committed because we don't properly take the time to clarify the nature of the problem. So people might think critically, but if you make an error at the problem that you're thinking about and how you're defining that problem, it doesn't really matter. You can be the best critical thinker in the world. You've defined the problem wrong. You're going to come up with a wrong answer.
That's
right to the right problem, right? So now we teach skills for how do we stop ourselves, use what we saw through our analytic observations in order to properly define the question. So now we're not judging really yet. We're trying to say which variables now start to matter most in terms of this question that we have to ask. So now we are formulating better questions. Then we move to multivariate evaluation. Multivariate evaluation is the capacity to look at many different things and understand the comparative value of those different things. So instead of just saying, well, I got this piece of information and it's true, or this guy on that show said this and this guy on that show said that, and this is true and that isn't, right? It's rather to hold many pieces of information in mind at the same time and try to see how they matter relative to one another. And partly what we try to do when we get people to do that is realize that for most information that we get, not all, some is at the far right, I don't mean far right, far correct or far incorrect. Okay? I wasn't being political. Right?
Not left and right. I got you.
Yeah. But most of it really has some value. Now, that doesn't mean some value, meaning that it is moving towards correct. It might be incorrect. But
Mhm.
the fact that it's incorrect should be telling us things as well. The fact that it's correct. So now we're holding many pieces of information in mind, and we're trying to understand how to better sort them out relative to one another rather than just quickly answering the question using a few smaller bits of information that we keep in more isolation, which is how most people's brains operate.
Yeah.
There's actually an intermediary step to drawing the conclusion that I haven't talked about in the TED talk because I had to cut it down and it was too complex to get into, but I'll mention it here,
Sure.
which is that the next step that we actually teach people is the capacity to complicate their own schema, which is to say that the one thing that humans can do that isn't in that cycle that all the other animal organisms can do is that we can think about our own thinking, right? There's no
Wow.
animal in the world has the capacity to look at a thought that it's had and then rethink that thought or observe that thought and decide whether or not it was a good one. Okay.
So, for example, there's the common phrase that we have now, intrusive thoughts, right? So you have an intrusive thought. I should just ram that person off the road. They cut me off. And then what I think I hear you saying is the next piece is, God, why do I think that kind of stuff? Right. So the contemplation of your own thoughts.
That's right.
That's
And
really interesting.
this is really a very critical piece because while everyone has the capacity for this, and we call it metacognition, while everyone has the capacity for this, very few people spend a lot of time doing it. But the
Mhm.
best critical thinkers in the world spend a tremendous amount of time rethinking their own thinking, examining their own thinking. What made me think that thought? What made me come to this temporary conclusion? What biases do I have? What assumptions am I making? Why?
Mhm.
What experiences did I have in my life that led me here? What information am I valuing more than others, and why am I that? When we get people to do that, the conclusions that they draw not only move so much farther towards correctness, but they become so much more insightful and deeper. Imagine if we had kids who spent just a little bit more time every day reflecting on their own thinking about the world and their own
Mhm.
decisions. Just a little more.
Mhm.
Imagine how much their lives would change as a result. Imagine in business, if we had managers, if we had executives who learned how to be able to spend a little more time examining their own thought structures and
Yeah.
questioning them, right? How
That
much
was what I
better
was
would
thinking.
your business be if your people could do that?
I was thinking about that very thing. The notion that, in JT's community, we talk about now, he's got this book, the difference between billionaire and millionaire thinking, right? Is it called Billionaire versus Millionaire Thinking, right?
Yeah.
And I
I'm
was
honored to be
wondering,
referenced in it.
what's that?
I'm honored to be referenced in that book.
Really love to hear that, man. I'm wondering about that kind of critical thinking for your economic viability, right? If you are unable to stop yourself from overspending, if you're not able to adhere to a budget, if you're not able to, there's a variety of different things that could be influential on your economic outcomes. It sounds like some of that is going to be in this critical thinking realm.
Absolutely. A lot of what you're talking about is called ESR, executive self-regulated thinking, which means that we're able to stop our impulses, our impulsive thinking, pause it, reflect upon it, and regulate our urges, in other words, right, through our thinking processes. And that's something we get better at doing as we get older. It's much harder for young kids to do it than it is for older people to do it because of brain development. But the more we can do that, it's parallel to what I'm describing in terms of being able to be metacognitive and think about our own thinking. The more we can do that, the more successful we are because we're able to
Mhm.
think about things.
Yeah.
We hear so many people who have met great success because they had one good idea, right? Something popped into their head and they ran with it and they had success. But that's really a real exception to
Yeah.
the rule,
It's not a
right?
replicable model. That was
Yeah,
lucky.
most of us have to grind our way to
Yeah.
better thoughts every day. And if we can give people a better way to accomplish that and an easier way to accomplish that, as well as to enjoy the process more, because thinking can be fun and interesting when you really learn how to do it better, then everyone can benefit from this as they go
Mhm.
forward.
Yeah. That's really great. I want to get to the fourth one, which is derive complex conclusions. But before we go there, I couldn't help thinking to myself. So I've been open about my father's struggles financially. My dad started off meagerly poor. built a massively successful consulting company here in the DC area with his partners, and they made a massive exit, which left them quite wealthy. And unfortunately, he didn't, the way I term it, he didn't have money mentors, right? He didn't have people who are coaching him through what needs to happen now that you have this lump sum of money. And what ended up transpiring for him was he continued his purchasing processes that he had before. And I'm going to tie this back to something that I think you were saying earlier, which is you can reprogram your own internal schema. So he grew up in his neighborhood seeing people buy shiny things, cars, clothes, and all of the stuff. And he replicated that throughout his life and unfortunately spent out all the money. He sadly died broke. The reason I raise that is because I have consciously made the decision not to do that, right? I was on that trajectory because I was doing what I learned from his example, and I have caught it earlier than reaching his level. And I've started to invest, and I'm doing a lot more to build out entrepreneurial endeavors that are going to create income outside of me being at work, etc. My point is, I think I have reprogrammed my schema based on what I learned from him. Help me understand, is that roughly correct?
Well, I don't know if you reprogrammed your schema based on what you learned from him. I think you programmed your schema based on what you learned from him. And you're constantly reflecting on and refining that schema based on what you learned from him, right? But it seemed like you saw it, you created a schema from that, and now you're refining it and using it as you go through your life cycle, right? As you go through your weeks and you're reflecting on what he did, and then you're using it to better inform and motivate what you did, which is a very wise thing to do. We should always learn from the people of our past, right?
And
Our
the states
parents
of others,
especially, and so forth.
right?
And that sometimes means what to do, of course, and sometimes it means what not to do,
Yeah.
because nobody around us is perfect. So we can also learn what not to do from them. And that's one of the things that you've acquired.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful.
That's great. So tell me more about deriving complex conclusions then. What does that mean?
Stop trying to be right.
Mhm.
That's what it means. Right is a fictitious idea. Very rarely can we ever be right. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, settle. We're done. But other than that, right, most of the problems that we face in life, they don't have a right answer. There are very good answers sometimes, and sometimes we surely come to very bad answers, right? But right isn't really something we should chase. And that's what we've always taught students to chase. And as a result, that's a lot of what we always are trying to do in our lives is we think we want to be right. And as soon as we can get people to stop wanting to be right and instead be smarter, then we can achieve something, because smarter means more complex, more nuanced, more recognition of also where we still might be wrong. And you don't know how correct you might be and how good your answer might be till you know how poor it also might be, or the ways in which it's flawed, or there are things that we still don't know, or there are things that are gray. And the more we can acknowledge that, the better we refine our response. And sure, we reach a point where we have to make a decision. We have to choose door A, B, C, or D. And we all reach those points in our lives every day, many times, sometimes with big questions about our business and so forth. But let's stop worrying about whether or not we get a right answer. Let's get a complex answer to that. And the more complex answer, which might seem simple in terms of the final outcome, but the more complex the thinking process we get to that conclusion, and the more complexly we can represent that conclusion, including, as I said, what remains gray and unknown and where we might be wrong, the better off we are. And that's where we really get to better. But
That's really awesome.
Schools particularly still teach students that they want the right answer. And we carry that through our lives for the most part. But it's crazy. That's absolute nonsense, because there aren't right answers to these problems that we face. There are better ones and worse ones for sure, right? So let's put it another way, right? Let's say, you and I somehow end up on a bridge, and it's a tall bridge, and you decide you want to jump off, and you do, and you live. Okay. And you landed in the water, you had a great time, and you get up onto shore, and I meet you there, and you say, Steve, look, you told me not to jump off the bridge, and I did. Clearly I made the right decision.
Right.
Okay. You might have made the right decision in that particular instance. It was not a smart decision, Damon. Right. 99.9% chance that you would have died jumping off that bridge.
Right.
Right? That was a dumb decision.
Right.
Right? It
And
was the
on
right
that
one. I guess
bridge,
you're right. It was the right one.
yeah, quite literally, circumstantially, if I had moved over 5 feet and jumped from there, I would have hit the rock
Right.
and died. Right.
Right.
So I just happened to jump in a gap potentially. So it was a lucky wrong decision. I see exactly what you're saying. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So right decisions, who cares? Right?
Yeah.
Smart decisions. Those I like.
Yeah. I'm with you. I'm currently working a lot in AI strategy, and I'm using AI all the time. And I've got some great AI projects coming up. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that people are, I'm going to joke and say, losing their brain cells to AI as well. They're just alleviating the thought process in our own heads and saying, AI can think for me. And, the concern is that studies are showing the more people use AI for their thinking, sometimes critical, I'm sure, the less they're retaining. And I suspect that it is damaging for what I'll loosely call your critical thinking muscles. I don't know what you call it, but however you develop these processes in your head. Tell me your feelings about AI's impact on people's critical thinking, and what are you working on to utilize AI maybe for good as opposed to allowing it to continue to deteriorate people's brain powers?
So not my thinking about this, but the research is coming out and it's pretty clear. Okay. What you said metaphorically is literally true. AI is killing brain cells. It's killing critical thinking ability. A big Microsoft study, in fact, just dropped on that about how it's destroying people's capacity to think. Thinking is like a muscle. Okay. The brain's not a muscle, but it operates like it.
Right.
If
More
we
you
use
use
it,
it, the stronger it gets.
that's right. Because you're literally building neural wiring when we think. The brain's always rewriting itself. So if it's no longer using that neural wiring for thinking, it very quickly, it doesn't take very long. It very quickly starts to say, well, then let's use those wires to do other things. And then it literally is losing the capacity for you to think better in the future. And there's been plenty of research on this. It's not to say that AI doesn't have any good uses. It does, for sure. There's no question about it. But when we use it to supplant our own thinking process, as opposed to maybe get us more information to think about or what have you, when we use it to supplant our thinking process, you are damaging your capacity to think tomorrow by using AI today. And that goes twice for kids whose brains are in faster stages of development than ours in certain ways. Okay. So as kids use AI, it's degrading their capacity to think critically tremendously. So I have plans to use AI for noble purposes to teach people critical thinking. That's a different project. But what I would encourage everyone listening is don't use AI in place of areas where you can think critically yourself. And that even goes for things like writing that email response, right? Everyone's saying, I can get the AI to write my email response and it will be much faster. You're right. AI will do it much faster than you. Okay. But tomorrow, when you need to write an email response, or you need to think through what would be an email response, even if you're not writing one, you've just diminished your capacity to do it.
Yeah. You've
Right?
messed up the skill. Isn't it interesting? My wife and I had a great conversation about the utilization of AI and the differences between the generations growing up with AI. So my wife and I, we were latchkey kids. We came home, we were responsible. You had to think through every single thing that you had to do to get your homework done, to get yourself fed, to do all of the chores that were supposed to be done before your mom gets home so you don't get in trouble. Like, you had to think through all of that stuff. If I'm supposed to be home before the lights come on, what time is that? And how soon do I need to leave in order to get there? And so there's a generation of us that were taught responsibility that inherently required some critical thinking in it. The next piece, though, is this generation, more like my son, which I will loosely refer to as digital natives. They're the ones who grew up with an iPhone or an iPad in their hand. And so every single question they've ever had, they could go on a device and go to a search engine and ask that answer versus picking up a book and having to read through the history of how this thing developed, why we're at this state now, and what their ultimate answer is. My point in raising this generational difference is the current generation that's going to come up behind my son is going to be one that has devices in their hand and AI in it, which is going to be a blessing and a curse. They're going to have more information at their fingertips than they've ever had before and potentially learn a lot. But at the same time, that critical thinking muscle that you and I just talked about is going to be challenged because it won't be exercised as much as early. And so the conversation my wife and I had, she went to law school. She told me the stories of having to go to what they call the stacks,
Yeah.
all of the books that
Yeah.
you had to go there and you had to read every single case that you thought might be applicable to the argument you're making, and then understand why it's not applicable so that you can make the argument. And you have to find the case that is applicable so you can cite case law. Similar thing in medical school. You have to sit there and read the medical book and understand what every single piece and part of the body is and all of the medicines that interact. And I guess I'm wondering, at the end of the day, a digital native with AI in their pocket is going to have some lazy thinking. Are they going to be able to sit there with the patients to read through the stacks? The stacks are probably gone. Are they going to have the ability to sit there and read the medical book? I don't want a lawyer who, when I'm in court for, whatever I've done wrong, is not able to cite case law because they have to look down at their phone and go to AI and scroll through. You know what I mean? So I'm really concerned about the future generation and their current interaction with all of these devices and all of this AI knowledge. I'm curious what your thoughts are on some of the things that I've just said.
Yeah, you're right on spot. It's terrifying. I'm really actually terrified for the upcoming generations in terms of the research of what AI is already doing to damage their thinking skills. It's I say a simple rule for my son. AI is good for the things that you can't do yourself thinking, right? If you can think your way through it, don't use AI. AI is great. So they're using AI because it might be able to come up with a cure for cancer faster, right? By assimilating all the research and running multiple experiments and so forth faster.
Right.
That's better than what we can do.
Yeah. If
Right.
it was going to take me 10 years to read all the cancer research to finally possibly get to the answer, let's use AI to accelerate that. I'm with you.
I'm with you, right? Because we all want that cure for cancer and we can't do it the way AI can do it. That's different than what you're describing when you need a lawyer who can think, right? Now, let's use a different analogy. Let's say instead of AI, we had a prosthetic that helped us to walk. It helped us to walk faster and run faster. Okay, so you had these devices on your, apparatus on your leg and allowed you to run faster and walk around easier, and you didn't have to expend as much energy and so forth. You said, great, I have this prosthetic. Look how fast I can go, Steve, right? And it's easy. It's a lot less effort.
Yeah.
What happens when you take them off? Well, now you can't really walk as well anymore.
And you become
That's AI. Do you want it? If we had a thing and we said, oh, you can wear this and you'd walk better, except, when you take them off, you can't walk at all. You're going to be paralyzed because your legs are going to be so weak. No one would want to use that.
Yeah.
Right.
It'll create addiction.
Yeah. But with AI, everyone says, I can be so much more efficient. Yeah. Short term. You're right. You're being more efficient short term. Long term, you're not going to be able to think as well. Choose wisely between those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. Great call. Wow. I guess I would love to know, we could sit here and talk about critical thinking and AI all day, but I know you've got other parts of your life that you enjoy. You've written books and you do some other amazing things. Tell me about some of the other things that fuel Steve's passion.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things, I have it here actually, just came out. This martial theory. I don't know if you can see it here.
Martial theory.
Martial theory. For anyone who's a martial artist, if anyone here is a martial artist or an enthusiast, or they know a friend, a kid, a brother, whatever, who does martial arts, this is my book that's thinking critically about the martial arts, what strategy is to martial arts, what tactics is for martial arts. And it's universal for every martial art. Doesn't matter which martial art they practice. And it makes a great stocking stuffer. You can find it on Amazon. It's really getting a lot of praise. It's very different than anything that's been written before about martial arts because no one's really done the deep dive into the thinking on those different aspects of the arts the way this book does. That's a sort of a side project. It's my other life, a lifelong martial artist and enthusiast. So for anyone who's into martial arts, please check out Martial Theory. I think you'll really love it.
That's really cool. What martial arts do you practice?
Man, over 40 years or 45 years now of martial arts training, I've done a large spectrum, everything from, I was into some of the ground fighting before it became popular. I've done Indonesian arts, Filipino arts, Chinese arts, Japanese arts, Okinawan arts. I've even done Irish arts. So I really run a large Russian arts. So I've done a large spectrum on it. And yeah, I just love it all. I have a problem when I'm teaching my students and I'll teach them an aspect of martial arts and I'll reference a style or an approach to martial arts as we're doing this particular thing today in class. And I always say to them, my problem is that's always my favorite one. Oh, this martial art we're doing today, that's my favorite. And then we're doing something completely different and it represents a different martial art. I'll say, this is my favorite.
Right.
We should
every single day there's another favorite.
I'm broken that way. I just love
That's funny. There's a worse way to be broken. I could see you being broken like that being just fine.
Yeah.
Steve, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and the Critical Thinking Institute, what are some of the ways that folks can find you online? Where are you located?
Yeah, find me in a different couple places. I have my own podcast called Actual Intelligence and a Substack, Perlman Actual Intelligence. You can reach me through there, but also email me directly. I'm at stevejp@thectinstitute.com. stevejp@thectinstitute.com. Just get in touch with me. There are online courses for kids and adults at the Institute. And also do occasional in-person live trainings for groups. For anyone who would like to personal interaction and personal training like that, they can get in touch and inquire about when the next one's ramping up for that as well.
Amazing. Steve Perlman, thank you so much for your great work and for your time here, man. I really appreciate it. All the best to you.
It's been a real pleasure, I have to tell you. It's a great interview.
Thank you, man. Take care.